At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 5 this morning is the provision of traveller accommodation, and today's meeting will involve an engagement with the expert group on traveller accommodation. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Professor Michelle Norris and Mr David Joyce to today's meeting. Before we begin, members, just a note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2019, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you were directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Professor Norris to make her opening statement.
It's myself, Chair.
It's yourself, sorry, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair and members, thank you for your invitation to present at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing. As requested, I hereby provide an opening statement for the assistance of the committee. In 2018, the Traveller Accommodation Expert Group was established by Minister for State for Housing and Urban Renewal, Damien English GD, to review the Traveller Accommodation Act 1998 and other legislation and impacts on the provision and delivery of accommodation for travellers. The expert group met for the first time on the 15th of October and have been tasked with thinking about the best way of approaching the delivery of traveller accommodation and providing the Minister with suggestions and key actions within the next 6 months. The background to the establishment of the expert group has been that the Programme for Partnership Government committed to the establishment of a special working group to audit the current delivery and implementation of local authorities' traveller accommodation programmes and consult with stakeholders on the key areas of concern. On foot of this commitment, the Housing Agency commissioned a report on behalf of the Department and an independent review of capital and current funding for traveller-specific accommodation for the period 2000 to date. The review had regard to the targets contained in the local authority travel accommodation programmes and actual units delivered, the current status of the accommodation funded and the funding provided for accommodation, maintenance and other supports. On foot of this report, the National Traveller Accommodation Consultative Committee advised the Minister to establish an expert group to review the Traveller Accommodation Act 1998 and other legislation that impacts the provision and delivery of accommodation for travellers. The terms of reference were drawn up in consultation with the National Traveller Accommodation Consultative Committee, and those terms of reference for the benefit of the committee is to review the effectiveness, implementation and operation of the Traveller Accommodation Act 1998 with a view to examining whether it provides a robust legislative basis for meeting the current and future accommodation needs of the traveller community, which takes effective implementation into account in the context of the recognition of traveller ethnicity in 2017. To examine national and international best practice in the provision of accommodation for nomadic communities to inform the legislative basis for meeting the current and future accommodation needs of the traveller community. To review other legislation that impacts on the provision and delivery of traveller-specific accommodation, including transient accommodation. To consult with all relevant stakeholders at local and national level, including traveller representative organisations and other stakeholder groups represented on the National Traveller Accommodation Committee and the local Traveller Accommodation Consultative Committees. Such consultation will include an invitation for written submissions and a series of meaningful national, regional and local workshops and focus groups, and then to draft and present a report and recommendations to the Minister within 6 months of the expert group commencing its work. Currently, the group is made up of 3 people, and I won't go through the bios. They are contained in the open statement which we made available. But currently, it's myself, David Joyce, my colleague Michelle Norris, and my colleague Conor Norton. And Mr. Norton sends his apologies this morning. He's actually out of the country on other business. In terms of the first and the initial focus of the working group, the first step taken by ourselves when we've met was to gain an understanding of the key themes, challenges and issues in which we have to focus on. And to this end, our initial actions have been a desktop evaluation of research papers and reports considering the findings and considering their findings and recommendations, a desktop study and overview of the planning code and planning issues, and a collation of planning statistics relating to traveller accommodation. An understanding of current expenditure on traveller accommodation, and specifically broken down annual count, census figures and traveller homelessness, and some of the initial themes and barriers to the effective provision of traveller accommodation identified by ourselves and which we intend to focus on are land use and planning and the interaction of the legislation and systems with the legislation on planning for traveller accommodation provision, social housing provision and particularly the provision of traveller-specific social rented accommodation, for example halting sites and group housing schemes, accurately measuring travellers' preferences for traveller-specific accommodation and social housing compared to standard houses and apartments, and the role of approved housing bodies in the provision of traveller accommodation. The increased use of private sector accommodation by travellers, rented or privately owned, and the push and pull factors and advantages and disadvantages associated with this development and how travellers who wish to secure private accommodation can be supported. And the key gaps in data provision which impede the effective policy design and implementation, for example, annual patterns of movement of travellers. The next step the expert group intend to take is to complete the desktop evaluation, including our review of planning legislation, and then commence a consultation process. The expert review group are now planning face-to-face consultations later this month, and the expert group will meet with CANA, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, the Irish Council for Social Housing, and Dr. Anna Vissa of the Oireachtas Library. A member of the expert group will attend the next local traveller accommodation consultative committees meeting which has been held with Offaly local traveller accommodation consultative in November. And wider stakeholder consultation will take place in November and December, with written submissions being requested from local traveller accommodation consultative committees and local authority social workers and other key stakeholders. We hope that this joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Planning and Local Government will afford the members an opportunity to participate in this consultation, and we are looking forward to hearing your views on the expert review group on traveller accommodation. And I thank you very much for allowing the opening statement and take questions from the committee.
Mr. Joyce. Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and David, thanks for the opening remarks. I suppose, first of all, just for my own part, is to warmly welcome the establishment of the expert group. We've had at this committee quite a lot of discussions around traveller accommodation and the failure of government, local or central, to spend the funds that have been allocated and to provide the housing that has been included in the local traveller accommodation plans. So I think there's an openness among many of us in the committee to see significant changes or to consider good proposals that would allow us to tackle that, particularly with mind to the fact that we're going to have local government elections next year, and therefore a fresh round of a local traveller accommodation plan for the 5 years after that. And I think maybe part of the reason why some of us asked you in here today, because we knew you were only starting your work, so it wasn't so much for you to give us an awful lot to report on because you're only beginning, but maybe to hear committee members' views and to give you a sense of maybe where this committee is at. So just to comment on some of those things. We've been tracking very, very carefully, both before the report was published last year and since, just the chronic underspends, and particularly the chronic underspends in specific local authorities. There is a mixed picture out there, and we acknowledge that. And we're also very aware, just from our own experience, that often there is an unwillingness to provide land. There are politics around the approvals of the apartheid planning process. There are complexities around consultation. There are local traveller accommodation consultative committees that work well, and there are others that hardly work at all or are very poor. So we understand that they're, I suppose, some of the key things that you're going to be looking at. And I think many of us in the Oireachtas would probably like to see quite radical recommendations coming back from the group in terms of options for government. Because it's just, if you look at the figures, it's intolerable to think, for example, in 2017, where local authorities overspent their standard social housing budget by a factor of 100 million and had to come back to the Oireachtas and the government and seek approval for that extra 100 million. In that same year, the underspend in the travel accommodation programmes was the worst recorded. It was a 45% underspend, with a number of local authorities spending nothing at all. So at a time when local authorities are clearly able to spend, and that's even with social housing projects that can sometimes be politically controversial, they can get over those humps. So clearly the problem isn't the system per se of delivering housing, but there are other factors in there. And I have no doubt, and I'll say it publicly, while there are many reasons why individual projects are slower to deliver, prejudice operating at a community level, at a political level, at a management level is one of the key factors. And I just think we have to be honest about that. And where prejudice is clearly a barrier, we have to find mechanisms to put in place to then take those decisions away from some of those people, or at least to have the sanction of those decisions being taken away and handed somewhere else to deliver. We had a lengthy discussion at the Dáil Housing and Homeless Committee on this back in that. And there was a proposal that where local authorities had a track record of not drawing down the money to spend in accordance with their travel accommodation programmes, that function be taken away from them, even for a time-limited period. And the idea was that not we wanted to take the powers away, but at least if that threat was hanging over the local authorities, that might add an additional incentive to draw down the money and spend, but if not, to make sure it was spent through some other mechanism. We couldn't get agreement at that committee, so it wasn't in the recommendations. The committee was split almost 50-50, but given that since then things have got worse, I do think we have to revisit that, whether it's in terms of the Section 183 land disposals, whether it's Part 8 planning proposals, etc. I do think we also need to have a look at, and Michelle has a lot of expertise in this, just on the approvals and the procurement process, because they are also factors in the delay of some of these things, and if there are ways of speeding those up. So we know, for example, the government is about to increase the financial threshold for the one-stage approval process up to 7 million, which gives you a development of about 20 units or so. There might be an argument to looking at having a specific one-stage approval process for traveller-specific accommodation if that 7 million is too low, and that might be something that the committee could look at, the expert group could look at and maybe come back with. Some other smaller things might be useful. We now get a very useful report from the Department quarterly, the Social Housing Construction Pipeline Report, and it gives us a project-by-project breakdown of where all of the new build social housing construction by approved housing bodies and local authorities are at. I think we need something like that for traveller-specific accommodation. So this committee could track, for example, on a quarter-by-quarter basis, where the projects are at, which ones have been held up, why, and add that level of transparency. I suppose the other big thing to say is the spend in and of itself, I suppose, isn't the only issue, because the report from the Housing Agency shows while the overall underspend was 13%, the failure to deliver, or the under-delivery of units, was actually 31%. So it's also what it's spent on in terms of new units or refurbs or those things. And certainly we're keen to hear ideas around that. And then maybe just the last two things, Chair, is obviously consultation is such an important issue here, and there has been widespread misreporting and miscommentary and misinformed commentary on the situation in terms of the housing units in Tipperary at the moment. One thing that's very clear from that is whatever about the detail of it, the consultative process clearly failed. Because if that consultative process had been more effective, I don't think we'd be in the situation where we now are in. And again, how do we make sure that at all stages, pre, during and post Part 8, for example, or any other planning process, that the travelling community, and particularly people who are going to be living in sites or units that are being developed, are centrally involved at all stages and not in some informal way at the very outset. And I suppose the last thing is, should we be thinking about sanctions for local authorities in other areas of their expenditure if they fail to spend traveller accommodation budgets and meet their statutory requirements? So, for example, and again, I'm just throwing it out there, I think if a local authority knew its roads budget, for example, might be withheld if it didn't spend its traveller accommodation budget, might focus the minds of elected representatives to do what they're legally required to do under the traveller accommodation programmes. So I think, I suppose, certainly what I'm saying to you is I'm inviting your expert group to be as radical as possible, to put as many things on the table as possible, not because I want to see local authorities sanctioned or have powers taken away, but I just don't think at a time when finally traveller accommodation budgets are beginning to increase. Not a single euro of the post-recession increase in traveller accommodation allocated to local authorities has been spent. You look at over the last 3 years as the budget started to increase, that modest increase has remained completely underspent. And when I say modest, we need much greater expenditure than that. So I suppose they're just some thoughts for you to consider. My last point is this. I appreciate you have a huge amount of work to do. And this isn't me telling you what I think your job should be, but the three of you are far more expert than any of us in this committee. But we're about to enter into a local government cycle, and getting legislation through the Oireachtas will become increasingly difficult the closer we get to that local government cycle. We just need to be honest about that, and therefore the earlier recommendations can come back to government, even initial headline recommendations around some of the legislative reform. The more conducive the political environment will be, I think, to consider those rationally and progress those through the Oireachtas. I think if we're looking at very significant proposals in terms of changes to how Section 183s or Part 8s are operating on within a couple of months of a local election, that's going to make it very difficult. And if we don't get some of these changes in either just before or immediately after the local election, they're not going to inform the next 5 years of traveller accommodation plans and budgets. So I suppose, without saying that you should do your work quickly at the expense of its quality, I do think you should be mindful of the political time frame that we're operating in, because there are many of us here that would like to get good things through. The Minister has been in with us, and I think he wants to get good things through. That space is a limited space, if you like, in terms of how the electoral cycle will impinge. So just I suppose to put that on your list of considerations as well.
Thanks, Owen. Senator Kelleher.
Yeah, I mean, I would be echoing many of the comments that Deputy O'Brien has made. I suppose I just wanted to ask, what specific work you are envisaging about a root and branch examination of the role of the local authority as a specific part of your work. Deputy O'Brien mentioned the underspends, and I want to put on the record the underspending in Tipperary, which was the local authority at the eye of the storm. In the last 18 years, they've underspent to the tune of 4.7 million. So that's a very, very significant underspend, when in the media the spin was all about money being spent, and not that that was always a very accurate account of money being spent and people not taking up the offers. So I think it's really important to in the work that you're doing, that underspending matter is examined, and the specific nature of local authorities in relation to those underspends, the political activities, the discriminatory practices among elected members in opposing accommodation. I think it would be very important that that came out of your review, and not to avoid that or skirt around that, because we all know that that happens, and that you would name that, and the efficacy of local measures like the local traveller consultative committees. Time and time again, I hear them criticised anecdotally as not being useful or helpful, being talking shops. But again, in that root and branch examination of the role of local authorities in delivery. And if you could, as an expert group, take a view as to whether what we're talking about is reforming the local authorities, applying sanctions like those that Deputy O'Brien has outlined, that if you don't spend your traveller budget, you don't get other budgets either, or whether actually we should be looking at something far more radical and not wasting energy at reforming something that's irreformable, given perhaps very latent or not so latent prejudice among elected members representing their communities. So would you also be open to examining the establishment of an independent national traveller accommodation agency, so that in your report back to us that you're being quite specific about addressing the issues that are there, on underspending, on the crisis that is there in terms of people's day to day, safety issues, overcrowding issues, and again to ask if you could maybe make some interim report as well, so that, you know, in terms of the political cycle, we're not missing opportunities to get kind of any legislation on the stocks. And finally, around stakeholders, I think the consultation with stakeholders is going to be critical. Groups on the ground have been doing an awful lot of work and research, and it would be important that the expert group tap into it. For example, I know that in North Cork they've been conducting extensive data gathering and research about concerns on the ground among members of the traveller community with accommodation, and so rather than reinventing the wheel, to take note of those pieces of work and research that are there, and that, as well as the local traveller consultative committees, that you would also be connecting in with local traveller development groups, because I think they have the finger on the pulse in terms of the issues that people are facing on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Keller. Deputy Casey.
Yeah, I'll be brief, and thank you for the presentation here this morning, and welcome the establishment of the expert group, because I think at this stage it is time to get to the bottom of exactly what is stopping the delivery of traveller accommodation, and whether that be political blockages or administration blockages, or even indeed critical piece of infrastructure that might be missing. Because I know in my own situation in Wicklow, while we were trying to identify a number of transient halting site, key issues there would have been infrastructure, lack of infrastructure around transient halting site to deliver them. But equally, I do understand and acknowledge that there's a lack of political willingness out there to deal with the traveller issue, and in some authorities, the administration don't really want to deal with it. It's probably the only budget in any local authority that's not spent, and I think if you look at any of the other budgets, they would all be spent up over and above what it is. So there is a serious issue that needs to be dealt with. That's why I welcome the expert group, and I welcome your report whenever it's published, and the sooner the better. I think Owen has identified we're coming into a local election cycle, so it will be hard to get decisions made the closer it becomes to that date. And, you know, if the local democracy isn't working, well, then we do have to look at removing it from local democracy. Sadly, I would be a full advocate of supporting local democracy, but if they're not willing to make the hard decisions, well, then them decisions have to be made somewhere else. And if that's at national level, I think it does need to be looked at. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Pat. Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Chair. So, I think when we have a conversation about traveller accommodation or lack thereof, we're having a conversation about human rights and the denial of human rights. So the expert group has clearly important work to do, and the recommendations that it comes up with are important for the travelling community, for society, and for human rights within the society. And I think the discussion needs to be framed in that context. To give one example, the fire in Carrickmines. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, I think that local authorities across the country generally moved to take some action. They moved to take some action under pressure of public opinion, and with a spotlight being shone on the inaction of the past. So what was done? There was some signage, there was some firefighting equipment installed on sites, there were some smoke detectors placed on sites, there was an element of training given. But as the weeks rolled by and the months rolled by, less and less was done. And at a certain stage, it came to a standstill, or to a virtual standstill. Was the job complete when things came to a virtual standstill? Far from it. Very far from it. I would highlight in particular the question of overcrowding on sites. I understand that the best practice and what's meant to be achieved is that there would be a 6-metre gap between mobile homes, caravans, buildings, etc. There is overcrowding on traveller sites in this state and in the city, where I'm a public representative, which don't meet that, not by a long shot. If you look at the halting site at Spring Lane, in Blackpool, Ballyvolane, in the north side of Cork City, the overcrowding situation there, if anything, is worse than it was a couple of years ago. And the fire safety precautions that were meant to be implemented nationally in the wake of that tragedy do not apply and do not come close to applying in daily practice on that site. Is that the only site in the country where that's the case? I very much doubt that that is the case, and I would have plenty of anecdotal evidence that it's not the only one. So I just use that as one example of a situation that needs to be addressed with urgency. There is an elephant in the room here, and the elephant in the room is the recent presidential election, the conversation and debate that was had around that, and the aftermath of it. It's not been unusual to have wannabe politicians and wannabe councillors playing the traveller card in local authority areas in order to big up their vote. But this was on a level that's not been seen before in this state. A candidate in a national election, in a presidential election, in my opinion, cynically stirring up and appealing to anti-traveller attitudes in society in order to cynically boost their profile and their vote. And as we know, unfortunately, that was done with some success by the candidate in question. I would just say that against that backdrop, there could be a pressure or a perceived pressure on the expert group to go easy, to soften the approach, and to come up with recommendations that don't rock the boat. I would say, actually, that in the aftermath of that controversy, it is more important than ever that the expert group comes up with recommendations that are bold, that are radical, and that address the festering issues and problems that are there. This is an issue which has been pushed to the side, as shown by the lack of spend in so many local authorities, for far too long. And it needs courage, and it needs proposals which match the needs of the situation, including addressing the human rights issues that clearly are there at the moment. So finally, on the question of steps for consideration, I would say a spotlight needs to be shone on the lack of action and the lack of spending by local authorities, and then proposals on how do you address that. 9 councils did not invest any funds whatsoever on housing schemes last year. only 7 drew down 100% funding. I know that in the Cork City Council area, despite the fact that there's at least 50 families living in overcrowded conditions, 97,000 out of a fund of 1.1 million was spent. In fact, I think in the country as a whole, there was more than 4 million funds allocated that were not spent last year. I won't labour the point, you know the information yourself. I have to say, I thought that the information provided to the committee by Senator Colette Kelleher is a figure that I'd not heard before. 4.7 million over 18 years allocated and not spent in Tipperary.
Yeah.
Well, I think that puts the recent controversy into some context.
And it wasn't out in the public zone in all the heat.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a figure which, I won't say it says it all, but it says a lot in reality. So various ideas have come up here. The idea of having a sanction over the head of councils to say if you don't spend your budget, there will be sanctions put in place against the council on other fronts. The idea that the power be taken out of the hands of the councils entirely, and the powers be given to another entity whose job is to do what is needed and to address the problems. The only point that I would raise about that is there would have to be some form of democratic accountability and say in relation to that. But if that's something that we're at the stage we need to look at, let's look at it. Because the situation that has pertained for years and years and years has reached a certain point now where, you know, these issues need to be addressed and as a matter of some urgency.
Thank you, Deputy Barry. I just have a couple of comments to make, and I think in this room, notwithstanding yourselves and the people in the gallery, there's a lot of experience in local and national politics in this room and realistic views and options that could be pursued. I've sat through 3 development plans. I'm very aware of that TA sign, taking it on, taking it off, the problems that we have around that. It all comes down to communication, clear communication and information in the local authority in that particular area. And it's about bringing people with us, not leaving them behind, from all communities. And we do that through clear communication and leadership, and that leadership has to come from the local authority. I'm loath to take it away from the local authority because I think that will add another layer of bureaucracy, and they are the people best placed who know the demographic, who know the need, who know the want of their community in those areas. I'm also loath when it comes to sanctions, because I think when it comes to sanctions you put up a wall. I think it's far better to bring people with you than to put up a wall. And sanctions would be something at a very last call that I would do. I think you can always find a solution in everything, and I always believe nothing's insurmountable. But I'm also a realist, and we have 15 travelling accommodation programmes in Dún Laoghaire who are all very well maintained. There's some issues with some, there isn't issues with others. We've some issues in private estates, we don't have issues in other private estates. So, you know, you try to get a balance in the system here and a fairness in the system here. And it is up to the local authorities to come forward with solutions, with sites. There was a lot of information made available to this committee. Some of us took advantage of that, and I was delighted to meet with Anna, who carried out from the Library and Research her report, and who went through it in grave detail with me throughout the country, and raised a lot of issues that will need to be dealt with. And we have to look at the local level needs, the wants versus the needs, the need versus the want. We also have to recognise that some traveller families do want to be in a permanent house rather than traveller accommodation programme, and some don't. And I think it's about that desktop study that you're talking about, in actually getting that database together and finding out what is the need of the traveller community. There's numerous other issues that come up in relation to finding suitable land, objections to local communities, As we said, funding clearly isn't the problem. It's drawing down the funding that is the problem. But there has to be a willingness in that local authority to drive that. Local authorities are under fierce pressure as of late, obviously in delivery around social housing. But this has to be part of that, and I'm delighted that Minister of State Damien English wanted to get this expert group together, because he recognised that there is a problem here that needs to be solved, and that we have to recognise where those pinch points are and work with them together. But I think we also have to be fair about it, and you know, if there is families that are on the side of the road, right or wrong, or for whatever reason that is, there has to be a fairness there, that there is people who are living in that community. They have to be kept informed of what the situation is. We have to communicate with them, and we have to find out why that family has decided to be on the side of the road. Was it because accommodation wasn't made available to them? Was it because they weren't included in the system? Was it because the local authority aren't aware of them? Have all solutions been offered to that family? And if so, then there has to be a fairness then for people who live in that area. You know, so I think we have to be, there's a role to play here from all sides to tease through these solutions. And I don't think it's about pitching local authority against national government. I don't think it's about adding another layer of bureaucracy, asking another body to actually be the people to enforce this. I think it's a group like the group that you've set up that will actually come up with the radical solutions that are required. And make decisions on informed evidence that you'll collate, rather than one-liners or, you know, as Deputy Barry alluded to. I mean, none of us agreed with the comments that were made during that campaign, but there has to be a fairness too in providing traveller accommodation, and it has to be a need, a want, the demographic that's required in that area. But there has to be proper consultation, and that can be very difficult at times. But there has to be bravery in doing that. But there has to be a fairness. And there is, I mean, in my own area in Shankill, we have a family who are on the side of the road in a particular area. There's no issue, they're not causing any trouble in any shape or form. But there has to be a fairness. You know, there's people that are paying mortgages, are paying rent. So we have to have a balance here in the system too. And it is hard to strike that balance, and I think that's where your expert group will be pivotal here. And I think by doing that, we will bring people with us on it. And by working together, I have every belief that local authorities will play their role in delivery. But that has to be done in a manner that we can all support, and that local politicians support as well, and deliver homes in safe communities for families. Whichever one of you want to win, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks to the members for their comments and inputs, which are very valuable, and we will take on board. And we, I suppose, are cognizant of your role as public representatives and your experience in dealing with these issues on the ground, and the valuable insights you can make, bring to the process on that basis. Just to respond to some of the particular comments raised, firstly in relation to the comments made about variable output, you're entirely correct. So the Department of Housing latest figures they supplied us indicate that 67% of the total budget for traveller accommodation over the last 10 years has been drawn down. But the drawdown levels are very variable. So some local authorities have drawn down almost all the money made available, and then some local authorities have a zero drawdown rate. And I think Deputy Kelleher mentioned that in the last year 9 local authorities have drawn down no funding whatsoever, despite the fact that the traveller population without accommodation in some of those local authorities is high. So the 9 that have drawn down no funding are Laois, Mayo, Monaghan, Westmeath, Longford, Wexford, Kildare and Galway and South Dublin County Councils. So that flags an issue that the issue with traveller accommodation provision firstly, is solvable considering the very small size of the traveller population compared to the national population. I think that's the starting point we need to work from. Also, the policy nationally and funding nationally has improved and been honed and reformed a lot over the last 20 years. The issue is with the implementation of the policy, and particularly the differential implementation between different local authorities. We, as part of our work, have started to review the very extensive amount of evidence that's already been collated on traveller accommodation, both by the Department, the different traveller bodies. There's also a lot of research on traveller issues. So there's actually ample evidence on what are the problems. It's really an issue of collating the evidence, consulting with people and trying to identify solutions, particularly around the implementation side. I do acknowledge the points raised by the Chair around trying to balance actually achieving output on the one hand, in many cases against opposition from local politicians and local communities, and also trying to bring communities with you and bring local politicians with you. The system of local traveller accommodation committees that was set up following on recommendation of the Task Force and the travelling community has worked very well in some areas and has not worked well in other areas. So there is learning we can bring from the areas where it has worked well, and that's something we'll examine. Saying that, in the neighbourhoods or in the local authorities where it hasn't worked, there's no doubt there needs to be some intervention at this stage. Deputy O'Brien mentioned the idea around a national body, and that's been recommended in policy back since the 1980s but not acted on. The challenge you face with that is the particular local issues that operate in relation to traveller accommodation and the level of consultation with local communities, often required to deliver programmes. But the other side of it is that if we continue with the situation where there's such under-delivery and very, very uneven delivery around the country, the problem will never be resolved. And in some ways it creates additional problems for the local authorities who are meeting their responsibilities. So they can be, it's unfair treatment of the local authorities who are actually meeting their responsibilities if other local authorities are allowed to get away with the problem. So solutions like sanctions are some of the issues we will definitely be examining, and also the issue around centralisation of the function, although in view of the fact there has been success in some areas and the importance of local consultation, I think that would have to be a last resort recommendation. So the other points raised relate to the need for leadership from local authorities and leadership from elected members in particular, which I acknowledge. And then maybe just to flag some other issues which you didn't raise in your comments that we plan to look at. Local authorities are not the sole providers of social housing, so we will definitely be examining the role of approved housing bodies, which have been the major source of supply since social housing supply since the economic crisis in the late noughties. So we will be examining the potential for their role in social housing supply, including speaking to a traveller-specific approved housing body. We will also be examining the increased number of travellers in the private sector, and there are barriers to travellers accessing private accommodation that we plan to look at. Because in many cases, and the research commissioned by the housing agency shows this, travellers are pushed into private accommodation against their will and actually seek social housing. But in other cases, travellers actually, it's their preference to seek private accommodation, and if they want to, they should be facilitated in any other way, and barriers should be removed.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to add to the comments of Michelle, I mean, again, and welcome the views of the members of the committee, and some of them quite practical in terms of very straightforward things. I mean, I like the idea of being able to monitor on a project-by-project basis, which doesn't occur currently with traveller accommodation, that being implemented. I think in terms of the work we intend to do, and I think it's been outlined by Michelle, there is a significant interaction between planning and the planning process and traveller accommodation provision, and not just at the level of local authority development. I think this is to remember as well. There are many travellers who also seek to make their own provision. Some of it you could consider specific provision in respect of sites or halting sites for themselves, essentially private provision. That type of development is not open to travellers under our current planning, certainly not in terms of kind of the decisions that are made in relation to those sort of applications before the planning. So there is clearly a greater link between the objectives of a traveller accommodation programme and that being a material consideration in the planning process. I hear the comments of the chair as well in terms of a balance and a balance being struck. I think certainly where there is a clear link in the planning process and travel accommodation, that desire, that need to address local concerns can be met in an objective sort of way and removes it from a political consideration. The idea behind planning ultimately is that there is local consultation within it, but currently the provision of travel accommodation does not seem to be provided for within the entire planning process. And when I say that, I mean it in the context of families who want to provide for themselves. It creates an issue. So the entire dependency then of traveller-specific accommodation rests with local authorities, and then that rests with the particular political issues that arise in that context. So I do think we are certainly looking at radical proposals. Some of them may not be very radical, but certainly, you know, we are looking at and certainly take on board what's been said by yourselves as deputies in the National Parliament. You know, there are ideas that hopefully will be reflected at some level within our report. But trying to address that balance, I think, is addressed through objective legislation and removing, in some sense, the political capital, perhaps, that can be made from objecting to any type of accommodation, and put it into a more objective process as opposed to the current subjective process, perhaps. But again, I welcome certainly the comments around the table this morning, and you know, the concerns being expressed about the actual spend when it comes back purely to local authority provision are concerning, and is a concern to the committee, and certainly one of the areas we hope to see addressed in our recommendations.
David, any further comments? Owen?
Two small points. I mean, obviously there's been a very public debate about, I suppose, the more excessive language used by Peter Casey during his presidential election campaign. One of the things that concerns me, however, is from my experience, a lot of the anti-traveller prejudice that is most effective is the anti-traveller prejudice that doesn't allow itself to be seen or heard publicly. It's what happens privately between certain councillors and certain managers. It uses a language which is a world away from Peter Casey's, and would, you know, insist that it's not prejudicial and it's not designed to prevent travellers from getting access to the accommodation that they need and deserve. And I think we also need to be mindful of that in fact, for me, the most dangerous anti-traveller prejudice is the stuff that vehemently protests that it's not prejudice at all, it's actually about something else. And I only say that because that's actually the stuff that has a much more negative day-to-day impact in terms of the delivery of projects. That raises a challenge, which means quantifying that or proving that is much more difficult. But I do think it's important to say, I'm not at all disagreeing with Mick, he's right in what he said, but I think that needs to be named. And the second thing, and while it's a small bit of the picture, it still is worth noticing. I mean, we've spoken here obviously about the global spend, but for example, if you look at the spreadsheets provided by the Department for the Traveller Caravan Loan Scheme, it's the same picture. And one of the problems we're experiencing at the minute is that even when local authorities, for example, South Dublin is one, where elected members, against some resistance from management, managed to push through a budget allocation for a caravan loan scheme. They then get into all sorts of protracted arguments with management about the implementation of that scheme and the rules that are required. So we're in a situation now where in that local authority we agreed a budget for travel accommodation before this Dáil was elected, when a number of us were still on it, and not a single euro of that has been made available to people yet, because of arguments over what is the best way to implement that scheme in terms of the financial rules and regulations. So maybe it might be one element that you could look at in terms of, again, clearly there's implementation issues with the loan scheme and it's only a small bit of the overall picture. That would be something worth looking at as well.
Peter Drucker, who's the well-known kind of business guru, he says, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And I think that in your considerations and in your proposals around the law and policy, I think it is really important to be mindful of the kinds of things that undermine the implementation on a very ordinary level, like Deputy O'Brien has alluded to. So you may get the perfect structures, the perfect law, and the law actually on the face of it isn't bad law, but the fact is that it isn't working, and we have to understand what sort of under the surface, although perhaps not as under the surface as has been since the election, what are those impediments and how they particularly relate to the role of local government, and therefore to be mindful about looking at alternatives if those things are ultimately going to be serial blockages to the delivery because they reflect not just the prejudice of elected members, but the people that the elected members represent. And you could come up with a fantastic suite of solutions, but if they don't pay attention to those underlying factors and human rights, as Mick Barry said, then all of that will be as of nothing, because it'll just be undermined, delayed, peeled away and peeled back. So I think a component of your report needs to pay attention to those matters as well.
Thank you. Can I just make
of course.
Response? You're entirely right, Senator Kelleher, and I think we can forget the work. It's important not to forget the work that's been done at national level in reforming the policy, the procedures, the approvals. No doubt there's more work that could be done. But we've sought for the information that's available to us indicates the key barrier is that projects are not being initiated at local level. So we sought information from the department on applications for traveller accommodation funding as opposed to approvals, and 100% of applications are approved. We also sought information on the planning process, and the Part 8 process does provide a relatively fast-track planning solution to getting planning for traveller-specific accommodation. No doubt there are problems and niggles with all of these measures, but the fundamental issue is that applications just aren't being initiated. So and that's the fundamental reason for the variation between output in different local authorities. Some local authorities are active, other local authorities are less active.
Any further questions? No. Mr. Joyce, would you like to finish with anything, or?
No, but again, just I suppose to conclude, I said welcoming the comments that have been made by the members of the committee, and obviously in your request that we keep you informed, we're certainly open to that, and whether that involves further meetings with yourself as a committee, or whether we submit an interim report, we are open to that measure, and obviously we have a commitment. We've taken board the comments made earlier on about the timelines involved and the opportunity, I suppose, in terms of the next local government cycle, and we'd certainly intend to work to the timeline we've been given, and hopefully not to go beyond that, because we also, as I suppose, members of the review group, do see the potential, for progress, given that there has been and there is a state commitment from the Minister in terms of our findings. So we do intend to obviously to try and meet, and definitely meet, that deadline at the summit to a large extent. But we are open to going back, if there are specific areas that arise in our work that the committee want clarity on, or want clarification. We're certainly prepared to come back and address that. Again, as it's finalised, and we welcome your certainly your comments this morning and very strong and very practical suggestions, which we hope we can reflect in some level in the report that we finally submit or finally produce. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. President Norris, do you want to say anything before we finish? No. You're right, thank you. Right. Okay, members, I would like to thank our witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee, and no doubt you'll be back with us again shortly. We look forward to that ongoing engagement. So members, this meeting is now adjourned. The next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held this Thursday, the 8th at 9:30, and it's the recent reports published by the DRHE and the Interagency Group, categorisation of homeless figures. Thank you, members.